Welcome to episode 188 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to review the Rolling Stones' second album, the second US release, from 1964, 12 by 5, which is released on London Records. This is a US only release. At this time, the Beatles and the Stones were both releasing their songs in kind of different formats in US and UK versions of albums. Typically speaking, the Stones' US versions are considered to be superior. In the Beatles' case, it's the English versions. This is obviously very early Stones. This is part of their journey of self-discovery from 1964 to 1967, where they try out a bunch of different things, they evolve consistently, and eventually, by the late 60s, they land on what would come to be known as their signature sound and their golden era. They're not in their golden era yet. They began, of course, as a young English band, very much obsessed with American music, in particular Chicago blues. So there's lots of blues on here, but they're also learning the craft of songwriting as they go, spurred on by their manager. There's lots of different covers of American artists, of course. This is still kind of the Stones in their tribute act phase, I guess. There's some high points, there's some missteps, and there's a few outright errors. In the very early weeks of 1964, the Stones had recorded their debut record. The previous year, 1963, had been a tumultuous one for the group. And recall, of course, that really it was only in January of that year that the 5 permanent members of the Stones, in this picture, had been playing together as a group for the first time. They changed managers in 1963 with Giorgio Gomelski, who was also managing the Yardbirds, being shown the door, and the untried and brash and assertive Andrew Loog Oldham, whose only real recommendation at 19 years of age was that he had been the publicist for the Beatles, and Beatles publicity was going pretty well in 1963, so you can kind of understand that. He comes in, and he decides pretty early on that another major change has to happen, which is that Stu Stewart, the keyboardist, didn't fit within his concept of a marketable pop group. He thought that 6 members was too many, and he also thought that Stewart was just not good looking enough to be one of the Stones, which, with a band with Bill Wyman in it is quite a statement. Mindful of the Beatles' success as songwriters, Oldham also began to urge the Stones, and particularly Mick and Keith, to move away from being a blues cover act and to become writers of pop originals. Their train hadn't really arrived at the songwriting station by the time that they released their first album. It's released in April of that year, and notwithstanding the lack of originals, it was still pretty eagerly consumed by the public. The Beatles, of course, had famously gone to America just a couple of months before. So after playing a few dates in the UK to back up the release of the record in April and May, on the 1st of June they landed in New York to begin their very first ever American tour. By all accounts, that tour was a bit of a hit-and-miss affair. They had committed the cardinal sin of touring without actually having a hit record to promote. Their second day in the States, they appeared on a TV show called The Hollywood Palace, which was hosted by Dean Martin, who proceeded to mock what was actually quite a good performance by the Stones and to mock their appearance and so on to get the middle-aged yucks. However, on the plus side, about a week later, they ended up in Chicago and they were able to do a bit of a pilgrimage, not only going to visit Chess Studios, but recording there for 2 days. By way of background, the Stones at this point, and really for the past several years, had been obsessed with the music made by recording artists with Chess Records. Chess Records was founded by 2 brothers, Leonard and Phil Chess, and it was the great blues label of the 1950s and very much the home of Chicago blues, by which we mean that electrified version of the blues made by all these musicians, many of whom had come north from the Mississippi Delta during the Great Migration in the previous couple of decades. The names of these artists are kind of a who's who of American electric blues: Little Walter, Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters, and it's of course from a song of Muddy Waters that the Stones actually took their name, plus Bo Diddley, Buddy Guy, and the real king of rock and roll, Chuck Berry. So for a bunch of blues-obsessed English kids, a trip to Chess Studios was as close to the Hajj as you can possibly get. They were also very interested in actually recording in the studio because they had been very frustrated by the sounds they had or had not been able to get in the English recording environment, where the producers and the engineers didn't really know how to record blues and rock and roll. In particular, there were prohibitions against playing loud, which made it very difficult for them to get the same kind of cavernous sound they were looking for. At Chess, of course, they were actually in the studio where all these great records that they idolized had actually been made. And even better, the in-house Chess engineer Ron Mallow was available to them for those recordings. They didn't make this whole record at Chess, but they did record a half dozen tracks, and they really felt that they got the sound they were looking for. They also got to rub shoulders with some of their idols in actually kind of a bizarre way. In one instance, they met Chuck Berry, who came to visit, and they were recording one of his songs. They also noticed that there was a guy painting the ceiling in the studio, and that turned out to be Muddy Waters, whose career was a bit of a low ebb, and Keith has described in interviews the weird feeling of seeing his god, his idol, in the very recording studio where he'd recorded the songs that Keith had sat down and listened to laboriously on his record player as he figured out how to play them over years and years. And here's the same guy painting the ceiling in the same studio where he'd recorded all these great songs, which apparently Muddy Waters was Well, very gracious, but just a strange moment. In terms of the gigs on the tour, the crowds they got, it was a bit bumpy. By the time they got back to New York at the end of June, their reputation had spread and they were headlining Carnegie Hall, and that gig was a huge success and there was a real sense of liftoff for the band. They returned to the UK, their record's been selling in the meantime, and they begin to experience the kind of mania in Britain which the Beatles had experienced, only with slightly more violence. And there's a number of different riots that happened at Stones concerts over the next few months. Like a lot of albums made when bands are suddenly booming in popularity, 12 by 5 is kind of cobbled together from different recording sessions in different places. When they'd gotten back to the UK, they'd released an EP called 5 by 5, which included 5 tracks from the Chess sessions, and all 5 of those tracks are included here. There's also 2 singles, the 2 B-sides to those singles, and 3 tracks which would end up on the Stones' second UK album, The Rolling Stones No. 2, which would come out in January 1965. The album includes 5 original compositions, which is an increase on their previous outing, and those are drawn from 3 different sessions, the Chess sessions in June, and then 2 different periods of time at Regent Sound Studios in London, one from the end of August through the first week of September, 64, and then again at the end of September. Those August and September sessions are surrounded with the Stones basically playing almost every night in the UK. Between September 5th and October 11th of that year, they played no fewer than 32 gigs. They then left on their second US tour, which began on October 24th, 1964, and this record is released on the very first day of that tour. On the second day of that tour, they play the Ed Sullivan Show, where the media hype and the frenzy of kids surrounding the band is so much that Sullivan says they're never playing this show again, which of course they duly do the following year. But no matter, this tour is a much bigger success. The record goes to number 3 in the States, which pretty much equates to liftoff, and the Stones' trajectory is basically set upwards. The first 3 tracks in the record are from the Chess sessions, and the first of those is Around and Around, of course, a Chuck Berry cover. This cover isn't as faithful as some of the songs on this record, which is a good thing. In kind of a funny way, mixed delivery is very English. It's kind of polite and it's kind of sterile, but the band is really on fire in the choruses, and this is a pretty solid number. The next song is Confessin' the Blues, which is a pretty solid effort at doing a Chicago blues cover. This moment is very much the peak of their tribute band era, and as a tribute band, they're pretty good. The third song, also recorded at Chess, is the very first original on the record, and it's Empty Heart. I always think this is a pretty underrated early composition by Mick and Keith. It's very dynamic, it's quite hard-hitting, it's let down, I think, by some messy production. Their cover of Norman Mead's Time Is On My Side follows. This is not the best-known version of the song, the one that you might have heard on Stones compilations. This is a different arrangement. It's got an organ introduction, played by Ian Stewart. The vocal delivery by Mick is less assertive, less snarling than the better-known version. I think it's also a little bit faster to its detriment. Next we come to another real highlight, which is Good Times, Bad Times, written by Mick and Keith. And this is one of their very first attempts at writing an actual blues song as opposed to a pop song. There is some fairly heavy modeling, I won't say borrowing, but heavy modeling on existing blues numbers by, for instance, Key to the Highway by Little Walter. I always feel that the song is slightly in the wrong key for Mick, but no matter how high-pitched and quavery he sounds, I just love this track. The last track on side 1 did really well for them as a single, and that's their cover of Bobby Womack's It's All Over Now. Side 2 starts with 2120 South Michigan Avenue, which is another group composition. It's got that really cool intro by Bill on bass, but it suffers a little bit from the same malady that afflicted a few of their tracks on their debut, which is it's kind of a half-formed song. Speaking of the need for fully formed songs, we now move to Under the Boardwalk, which is, of course, a fantastic song. And this is a really faithful cover by the Stones. If anything, it's almost too faithful. It's a bit kind of karaoke-ish. Congratulations by Mick and Keith, misspelled on the cover here as Congratulations, is next. It's pretty good. The strongest part about the song, I think, is the middle 8. Again, they're not really there as songwriters at this point. Similarly, Grown Up All Wrong is a song which has some good ideas, but is lacking a little bit in the melody department. Next is their cover of If You Need Me, which is probably one of the lower lights of the album. It's just kind of a weak cover. They redeem themselves slightly in the final track of the album, Suzy Q, which of course is a song famously covered by CCR a few years later, written by Dale Hawkins, a brother of Rompin' Ronnie Hawkins. Not a bad effort, in particular the guitar work by Keith and Brian stands out. If you're a fan of the Stones as a band, it's really about a couple things. Great original songwriting, this is the band eventually brings us songs like Wild Horses, and a unique reflected back from England take on the music of Black America. You don't really get either of those here in sufficient quantity or quality. The original songwriting really has yet to arrive, and the covers still sound like English kids in a Chess Records tribute band. For me, this record is 3.5 out of 5 stars.